Greetings! Welcome to another video in our series on Biothreats and Biodefense. This one, which is the third, is starting to discuss the agents which have caused pandemics and global problems. The one we're going to deal with today is Yersinia pestis, which has been responsible for 3 pandemics in the 5,000 years that it's made its presence known to mankind. The first pandemic began in the 300 or 400 years AD, and it was one that started in Egypt, having spread from Ethiopia, and it was responsible for large numbers of death, and it kept going for a long period of time. The Justinian plague is perhaps the most well recorded plague of that early phase in human history. It subsided eventually, and then later in the 1300s what emerged was what we now know as the second pandemic, and it rampaged through the Mediterranean areas and spread out through Europe. And one of the most famous aspects was of that pandemic plague, was the Black Death, which started in London, which was an extremely populous city at that time, a major centre for trade, and it killed large numbers of people, something like 60% of the population, and spread through other communities, through England and the United Kingdom, as it is now called, and also through all the other areas of Europe, mainland Europe. So this was the second pandemic, and then it subsided, and then in the 1800s, around 1855, there was the start of what we now call the third pandemic, which began in Hong Kong or close by. In fact, the origin of this pandemic is believed to be in China, in Wuhan. I think I heard of that name somewhere else, right? So it's still ongoing. There are 5 or 6 countries which are currently, in epidemics caused by this pandemic, global distribution of the pathogen. And one of these, for instance, is Madagascar, which currently is in the throes of serious plague. So we've never really eliminated Yersinia. In fact, there are foci hotspots which are present in most of the world, on all continents except actually Australia. And the reservoirs are not human. The reservoirs are animals in this case, particularly like rats, but also many other mammals are hosts to this bacterium. So, unlike many other diseases and the pathogens that cause them that we will cover, there are often other hosts which are where the disease is prevalent always, and it's from these other hosts that there's transmission eventually to humans. And once there's further evolution in some of these other situations, then these diseases become transmissible in humans, and that's very much the case with the various influenza A strains, and we'll be looking at the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic in the next video. So coming back to Yersinia, there is an interesting anecdote, and that is, if we take ourselves to Trinity College, Cambridge, then there was a young student, much like you guys. He completed his bachelor's degree in 1665 at Trinity College, Cambridge. He wasn't a particularly, noticed student. He was an undistinguished student, as accounts at the time reflected. But then, because of Black Death, they closed down the university, and the students had to go home and stay at home. And this lasted for 2 years. And so this young gentleman, whose name was Isaac Newton, studied on his own at home, and he came up with theories that changed the scientific and mathematical world. He introduced what is now known as calculus. He introduced theories on optics, and the most well-known is undoubtedly he came up with the law of gravitation. So, as the story goes, somewhere in that apple trees, I believe, were involved. So the salutary lesson there is that sometimes there can be profound and very positive changes emerge from pandemics. Obviously, overall, it's a story of tragedy and, huge losses, due to the pathology and the subsequent deaths. But there can be positive aspects to these things. Certainly, society in each of these instances is profoundly changed by the effects of pandemics. Looking at Yersinia pestis itself, it was discovered and described by a scientist at the Pasteur Institute, Alexander Yersin, and it's a gram-negative, the zoonotic bacterial pathogen. So even to this current day, when you're doing diagnostics, the first things you use are things like gram-negative staining. It's not a particularly fast-growing bacterium, so often, gram-negative and other stains such as Gimsa are very important in very rapid identification of the cultures. In modern times, they have developed PCR-based diagnostics. So obviously, as this causes rapid death, bubonic plague, you will die within a week. And then pneumonic plague, which is less common, you'll die actually within about 48 hours. And then there's also a third relatively uncommon disease caused by Yersinia, which is septicemic plague, right, where the blood is infected and it causes septicemia. So the pathogen has evolved multiple weapons over the 5,000 years or so. There's been gene gain and there's genomic reduction, and there are a complex series of virulent determinants which are part of its evolution from its nearest relatives, and there are 3 distinct plasmids involved. One actually is where the broad range protease, PLA, is involved. There's another which is associated with the production of the so-called murin toxin. There are outer membrane proteins that are changed. There are pathogen-associated molecular patterns, so-called PAMPs, and there are ion capture systems. So, in summary, this pathogen has evolved multiple approaches to in fact allow it to become the formidable threat that it is. And the major reason, obviously, at the molecular level, with all these tools, is why it's able to overcome the human immune system. As it has a vector, which is the flea, one of the more important aspects too of this pathology and epidemiology is that it's evolved a factor which actually facilitates the clumping of the bacterium and its production actually wrapped in a biofilm in the esophagus of the flea. And the flea, of course, bites the host, and so strategically you have a package of bacterial cells aggregated within a protective biofilm, which is then injected into the human host. So let's just go on now to diagnostics. Diagnostics have involved development of antibody and antigen tests, right? There are limitations with this approach because you need both, and even in the interpretation of these is sometimes difficult. The best diagnostics that have been developed are PCR based, and they exist, and they're very sensitive. But if you think about the disease itself, it can kill within a few days, so it doesn't give you a lot of time for doing tests, right? So logistically, it can help, obviously, to monitor the population that's yet to be infected, but in terms of those that are already infected, it's really not a tool of any significance, except as a post-mortem tool. So diagnostics is there, but its role is typically not that significant unless there's doubt about the cause, of course, of someone's symptoms. Naturally, there at the onset of a disease outbreak, it could be very significant. The main factors which were developed hundreds of years ago, are those of what we now talk about in the current situation in terms of health factors: isolating, quarantining, disinfecting, and also extermination as far as possible of the vector. And that's an interesting story, because back with the Black Death in London, it was decided that the vector was cats, and so they eliminated the cats. Well, as you know, it wasn't cats, but it was rats. So obviously that was not really a factor which contributed to the suppression of the disease. And as I like cats, I think that's a pretty sad story. Okay, so what do we have in the way of fighting this, the biodefense? Well, two things. We have antibiotics. These came into existence in the 1950s, and streptomycin to the present day is the primary antibiotics used over the last 45 or so years. So it's highly effective, but it is quite toxic. So toxicity is a factor, which is the case with many treatments. Antibacterial, antiviral, antifungal. That sometimes the treatments are such that toxicity can cause serious side effects or even death. So they have to switch from using streptomycin to another antibiotic once they've got some control, and for that purpose they use tetracycline. Penicillin is not effective really. It works in media. It's not because it's not an effective antibiotic against the bacterium, but in the human it proves not to be particularly effective, and obviously that's true for many many treatments that treated in a different system, you know, in vitro against the bacterium. With other animal systems, something may work, but when you translate it to the human, it's not particularly efficacious. There is multiple drug resistance, which has been identified in the current pandemic. But at this point, it's not a factor. At least it's not been identified as a factor, which of course would be particularly bad, because antibiotics are at the forefront in terms of combating Yersinia at this point in time. Vaccines have been developed. So there are live vaccines developed from attenuated strains of Yersinia, and also there are killed plague vaccines, right? But nothing new in the development of vaccines has occurred since around about 1967. So this is an area that's really been neglected, and you know, we sometimes think it's a thing of the past. You know, and as we know now, there's going to be a rethinking of these pathogens, which we know can lead to major problems, including pandemics, and we covered that in the previous video. So that's all I want to say. Think about Isaac Newton. You know, as you guys are students, that certainly there are opportunities, you know, as time goes on after this quarter, where you can basically think, create, and have some breathing space from what obviously is one of the examples of pandemics that's going to go down in the history. Probably one of the lead examples of a pandemic, which until recently we thought would never occur, most of us at least, in modern society. I'm going to give you a link to a video, you know, which was produced for Earth Day, and certainly in terms of thinking about pandemics and current situations, I think it's important to consider also that man has had huge impact on the environment. Our population has increased dramatically over the last 100 years. CO2 concentrations increased dramatically. Temperatures have increased dramatically. There's been destruction, massive destruction of natural habitats. In agriculture, it's become such that animals are produced in factories using antibiotics, so that they're under stress. There are, you know, very concentrated populations of these animals. Disease is controlled with these animals by antibiotic use, which in turn, you know, can have a significant negative impact on the diseases of humans that we control. And also, it's enhanced the kind of possibilities of changes in those diseases, bacteria and viruses particularly, that are part of the animal population but can subsequently be transmitted